And it's not every day that we get to hear from a Padma Shri award recipient. So thank you for being here. Dr. Subhash Kak is a Regents Professor in Electrical and Computer Engineering at Oklahoma State University, and has also been appointed to the Indian Prime Minister's Science, Technology, and Innovation Council. And his area of focus is artificial intelligence. Dr. Kak, he has written over 20 books. And while he has excelled in his scientific area, his extensive knowledge and understanding of Hindu scriptures, history, and languages is also something to be very, very admired. So rather than everyone wanting to listen to me speak, I'm sure you want to hear him speak. So without further ado, I give the stage to Dr. Subhash Kak. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja. Really happy to be here. I have this opportunity to speak with all of you. When we had an initial email on this, I was asked what should I have as my topic, and I suggested just offhand the secret of the Veda. And in fact, I do have a column written on it on the Medium. Medium, as you know, is a platform where people can post essays. So I have a column on the Medium called The Secret of the Veda, which you may want to visit if you haven't seen it already. You may want to visit it later because we may be, or we will actually definitely be discussing many things outside of that column as well. Okay, now what is the Veda, first of all, before we can go to the secret? As we know, the Veda is the the claimed fount of all of Indian wisdom. The Vedas calls itself Atma Vidya. And Veda, the word itself means knowledge. And Atma Vidya, of course, is the knowledge of the self. Now, in Mundak Upanishad, in fact, 1.1.5, it's stated that there are two kinds of knowledge, apara and para. Apara is the knowledge of embodied things, and very curiously, and in my view, very impressively, Mundak Upanishad says that the Veda is also apara. Apara is lower knowledge. So everything that can be woven into words is apara. And para is what binds it all together. Para is the intuition behind the words. So it is the deeper sense associated with one's understanding, because words always come up short when we are talking about anything. And so para is the deeper knowledge, and apara is attempts at description. So what this means is that even though the Veda has been, or the Rig Veda and the other Vedas and the Upanishads have been praised by scholars and writers all across the world. And in fact, in that particular column, I have a few statements by some of the leading philosophers of the West who say that the Veda transformed their life, or there's nothing as magical and wonderful as the Veda. But when people go to the texts, for example, if they get hold of a translation of the Rig Veda in English, such as on the internet, we have one by Griffiths, and this is at least 120 years old. And you find it very verbose, or you might find it going round and round without being able to make any sense of what is it that people who have meditated on it have found so astonishing and amazing about it. For example, in that particular column, I start with the very first verse, the first hymn, which is Agni Mile Purohitam Yagyasya Devam Ritvijam Hotaram Ratna Dhatamam. And what it superficially means is that I worship Agni, who is the priest to the gods, who is the sacrificer and who gives us all the wealth. And you might wonder, so what's the big deal? You know, what does it really mean? You're praising Agni, but what is the deeper sense? And in fact, it's that deeper sense that we want to visit in this talk. Now, the deeper sense is this, that in the Veda, we are also told that Agni is like speech. Fire and speech are similar to each other. There are all kinds of parallels being drawn because, as we know, all kinds of knowledge, even modern knowledge, is ultimately stories. And there are stories written in a appropriate, suitable language. And when it comes to quantitative sciences, the language is mathematics, or could be other descriptions, linguistic descriptions, or it is in terms of analogies. You talk of one thing in terms of another. So if there's something else that you can relate to easily, something in nature, then you would describe the deeper thing in terms of what is familiar, the unfamiliar in terms of familiar. Or as another example, the great haiku poetry of Japan, where you're constrained to have just so many syllables. There, the idea is that you speak of the most trite and obvious natural things and use those things to speak of the most subtle emotions. And these subtle emotions ultimately or connect up with paradox, because unlike straightforward mechanical descriptions, life consists of opposites. You know, whatever you say about life, the opposite of that is also true. And therefore, ultimately, the deepest insights are expressed in terms of a language which is paradoxical. In fact, in Brihad Aranyak Upanishad, there's a statement which says, Paroksha Priya Ivhi Devaha Pratyaksha Desha, that the gods love what is paroksha, which is not obvious, which is paradoxical, and they detest what is obvious. And what this means in this moment, in this time of coronavirus, what it really means is, and I want to draw some analogies with what's going on right now. What seems so threatening about the unfolding events of right now is that the suppositions on which people's lives or on which societies have been framed appear, those suppositions appear to be very hollow. For example, look at higher education. Now, all the college towns are empty because the students have left. They are being told that all that they can learn can be done online. And likewise, people's personal lives, where people would fly for hours to go off to a certain place, some resort, and then come back in 2 days. And now, and the reason why they were doing that was, apart from, you know, seeing the natural beauty, was also because they wanted to be away from themselves. But now they're forced on to their own aloneness, which is what makes one question the whole structure that that's at the basis of life. And that structure, to come back to the difference between the Veda and the foundations of modern life, is the fundamental idea of the Veda is that there is a transcendent principle which is beyond what is embodied, while modern life and modern society is based on the idea that there's nothing but embodiments, which means there is nothing but materiality. There is nothing but the bodies that we see, ourselves and people around us. While what the Veda says is that beyond all the embodiments is something transcendent, of which we are projections. So it is sort of a mysterious thing. It's a complicated thing. And therefore, it's not as easy to grasp as is the conception of an embodiment. And that's the reason why a lot of people find it hard, especially because the analogies that are used in the Veda are ones which one can get caught up in, and one might think that the analogy itself is the entire thing. To go back to the structure of the Rig Veda, there are four Vedas, as you know. You have the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Samaveda, and then the Atharva Veda. Originally, they're supposed to be three, and Atharva Veda was added on later. In the Rig Veda itself, the initial hymns in each mandala are to Agni. Then the following hymns are to Indra. And finally, the end of the hymns, or the rest of the hymns, are to Surya, or to the gods which reside in the skies. And what it really means is the following: Agni and speech and earth and body are compared. And then Indra and the atmosphere are in one category. And the Surya and the devas of the heavens are the third category. And what it means is that just as you have an outer reality, which consists of the earth, the atmosphere, and the sun, you have an inner reality with which it can be compared, where the body is like the earth, the various pranas are like the atmosphere, or like the various forces that work within, which is like the wind and everything else on the earth. And finally, just as you have the outer sun, you have the inner lamp of consciousness, or the inner sun. So there is this analogy. So it's a tripartite division. In the Gayatri Mantra itself, you have Bhu, Bhuva, Swaha. Bhu is the earth, Bhuva is the atmosphere, and Swaha, or Swar, is the sun. So you have this correspondence. And the whole question then is, we are first of all a mirroring of the outer universe. I am Atma Brahma, for example, or Aham Brahmasmi. All these Mahavakyas that you have in the Upanishads, they tell us that there is this mysterious correspondence between the outer and the inner. The Brahman and the Atman is the same. And it's because of this correspondence that it is possible for us to know. And if we could only be totally in touch with our own self, and we are sort of alienated from ourselves, because what you can do is you can imagine that you have this lamp of consciousness within, and the habits and the various sanskars which help us make sense of the outer world also separate us from this inner self. So they are like the various coverings on this light, and therefore all that we see are our habits, which, just as the blinkers that a horse on a chariot or on a horse carriage has, which lets the horse see only straight ahead on the road. Likewise, the blinkers of habit of the sanskars, which are good as well as bad. Good in the sense that they only let us see what we are already used to seeing, and therefore they conceal from us what is beyond them. And therefore, if we could break through these coverings or these avarans and be one-to-one with our true self, then all kinds of capabilities or siddhis would be available to us. So this is the idea. And a lot of what is done in the Vedic way and through its many different streams, the streams that some of which are much more recent, just a few centuries old, and there are some others which are much more ancient. is to come up with different disciplines for us to find ways of this uncovering of our own self, to go within. And doing so ultimately, of course, takes us through a whole journey of the inner world, where questions related to who we are, questions related to where we are going. So there's a psychology, there's a whole technique, or techniques of transformation, and letting go. And letting go is what yajna is, or sacrifice is, letting go of who you thought you were to become somebody else in this journey, which consists of these small steps which ultimately take you to the very heart of your being. So this is basically what it is if one were to draw a very broad brush picture of the secret of the Veda. You have these correspondences with the self as the sun, the mind as the moon, and just as the moon waxes and wanes, the mind waxes and wanes. And just as it is not very helpful to assume that the light of the moon is all the light that you have at night, that the source of that light, of the light from the moon, is the sun, which is what lies concealed within you. Now, what it also indicates, apart from all of this, is that, and this is something I alluded to in the beginning, that there are all kinds of paradoxes of logic, of conception, which are a part of this narrative. And these paradoxes are a consequence of the fact that Brahman is not a thing, or consciousness is not a thing. If consciousness, because here what we are saying is that your consciousness itself is the divinity that resides within you. And of course, this is an image which goes back to the Rig Veda. This is an image that you have in the Bhagavad Gita of Krishna and Arjuna, for example, and the senses, which are the horses which draw the charioteer in one direction or the other. And Krishna just watches, or there are two birds on the tree, and one of them is tasting the fruit and the other one just observes. So the fact that that the self is not a thing, is not a property, there is the reason why you have paradox, because it's something transcendental, and something that is transcendental cannot be expressed in terms of ordinary logic, because logic relates to properties of things. And in fact, this is the reason why you have various paradoxes in quantum mechanics. We were talking briefly of quantum mechanics also, because the moment you bring in the observer, there are all kinds of issues that happen. And for those of you who are interested in physics, for example, there is something called the quantum Zeno effect. If you observe a physical system without expending any energy, you can still steer the unfolding of the state of that system in whatever direction you want. And this is an idea which, of course, is a very ancient one in India. You have something called, in Vedanta, for example, Drishti Srishti Vada. The whole idea is, and this is an old debate, and the debate was, how does divinity control nature? Because after all, nature is governed by laws, by rit, or ritham, rit in the Veda itself. And rit is natural law. Well, in Drishti Srishti Vada, what it's stated is that divinity, through just observation, can steer the system. And it's incredible, extraordinary, that this fundamentally is literally identical to the conception that by observation alone, you can steer the state of a physical system to whichever direction you want it to go. And so this is what it is then. And of course, one can ask a whole variety of questions related to then, do we have freedom? And if you have freedom, where does freedom come from? Or what does one's practice imply as far as one's own development is concerned, one's own journey is concerned? And how does one relate one's physical self to one's inner self, or the physical world, the outer world to the inner world? So all kinds of these questions that one can ask, and the answers to them would of course depend upon the specific context of the individual's experience. And but freedom, talking rather broadly, freedom comes from the indriyas that we have, the senses that we have. The senses within them, normally they're instruments, but within them there is the possibility, if you use them appropriately, there is the possibility of transformation that they can provide you, as I mentioned, through the context of that example from physics itself. So a lot of what we have in Indian sciences, and these sciences have also, as we all know, have been quite central in the whole evolution of science elsewhere as well. For instance, as we know, Panini's grammar. Panini's grammar is, say, 2,400 years old. It describes Sanskrit language in terms of algebraic rules and rules about rules. And then this, in turn, through de Saussure and the French structuralists, gave rise to many social scientific disciplines in the West. So there is this genetic relationship. And as we know, in the other quantitative sciences as well, the modern scientific revolution is normally seen in the development of infinite series in Europe in this late 1600s or 1700s. But it so turns out that infinite series were also created in South India, especially in Kerala, 200 or 300 years prior to that. And there is a possibility, at least the case has been made, that the Jesuits took some of these ideas from India to Europe. And most interestingly, and this is something that I wasn't aware of until 3 or 4 years ago, the development of machine theory or computer theory or mathematical logic, which is normally credited to these three British scholars, Charles Babbage, Augustus de Morgan, and George Boole, in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, has an Indian connection. And this Indian connection was written up by George Boole's widow, who was also a science writer in England in the 1860s onwards. And she wrote a famous essay in 1890s where she said that these three scholars were, in turn, they belonged to a intellectual salon which was presided by George Everest, who was the Surveyor General of India for a long time, and after whom Mount Everest, which is, of course, in Nepali language, is called Sagarmatha. Mount Everest is named. So he had spent many decades living in India, and he would, from time to time, during summers, go back to England. And he, according to Mary Boole, for whatever it's worth, Mary Boole claims that he brought these ideas of Navya Nyaya, which are equivalent to mathematical logic, to Britain, And these three people then were able to recast that in a, of course, much more convenient symbolic language of mathematical logic, which is at the basis of all of logic circuitry, which is at the basis of digital computers and so on. So this is a fascinating connection. Another fascinating connection that we have, ultimately, of course, inspired by Vedic sciences, and I'll come back to that in a minute, is Vivekananda and Nikola Tesla. In 1896, Sarah Bernhardt, who was a French actress, the most famous actress of her times, she's visiting with a troupe from France to the US, and she throws a party in New York, and Vivekananda is there. She invites him as well as Tesla, and they have a long conversation. And we know about that conversation because both Tesla and Vivekananda wrote about it. Vivekananda in letters to his associates, and Tesla in his diary, where Vivekananda asked Tesla to come up, considering, since he knew that Tesla was interested in wireless energy transfer. In fact, he spent most of his life after winning the battle with Edison on whether alternating current or direct current should be used. Edison was in favor of direct current. Tesla was in favor of AC, and Westinghouse eventually chose to go with Tesla. And he was also the inventor of the AC alternating motor. So after that, he spent many decades trying to come up with ways to transmit energy by wireless. And he also conceived of, at least in his imagination, something like the internet, where this wireless energy could be used to send information from one point to another in a very free way. So what Vivekananda told Tesla was that, look, from what I know of the Vedic sciences, it should be possible to convert mass into energy. So if you do it, wouldn't that be wonderful? Because not only would it help you with your own dream, but also establish the Vedic sciences on a much more sound footing for the contemporary individual. So this is, of course, a very interesting romantic story. And what Vivekananda was really speaking of there was the Vedic scientific discipline of Vaisheshika. As you know, there are the Vedas, the Upavedas, then the various other subsidiary sciences, and then you have the darshanas, and the Shad Darshan, or six darshanas are Purva Mimamsa, then, which is like they receive knowledge, if I may use common terms for it. Then you have Nyaya, which is logic, and Vaisheshika, which is physics. Nyaya is analysis of speech, of utterances, while Vaisheshika is analysis of matter, which consists of atoms. So these are, instead of speech parts, these are matter parts. And then yoga and Sankhya. Sankhya is categories of counting in terms of reality, because one gets divided into a multiplicity, and yoga is the synthesis of it. And finally, you have Uttar Mimamsa or Vedanta, which sort of holds it all together, which tells you what the nature of reality is. Now here, Vaisheshika, I was astonished to discover, has very sophisticated analytical categories. And in fact, what I did 4 years ago, 2016, was to translate the Vaisheshika Sutras, which had been translated before by philosophers who were not as aware of its significance for physics as they ought to have been. So I translated this more from the perspective of a physicist or a computer scientist. And what's interesting there is that Kanada, the rishi who wrote the Vaisheshik Sutras, speaks of 6 categories. 3 are related to physical reality, which are dravya, and guna, and that is material, and transformation or speed. So these are material reality. And in fact, the point he was trying to make was that almost everything that can be said about the outside world can be determined by objects and their motions. But on the other hand, you also have the cognitive individual who is interacting with this reality, which is namely us. And it has also 3 categories associated with it, which are samanya, which is universal, vishesha, which is particular, and then samavaya, which is where these interact with the physical reality. And in fact, it constitutes a very, very sophisticated system, which in my view still needs to be examined for its continuing relevance. Now, continuing relevance, could there be any use for the Vedic sciences for the contemporary individual, contemporary man and woman? Well, quite obviously, yes. Why? Because as we know, we are going through one of the most disruptive eras in human history because of automation, because of what is more generally called AI. Almost literally all that we do can be done by machines. In fact, I was part of a group of people who met several times in the US and also in Cambridge, UK, a group of scientists and philosophers to look at whether computers of the future would become conscious. And about half the people thought that they would become conscious and half thought that they would not become conscious. But all of us agreed that computers will literally be able to do all that human beings do. And therefore, in contrast to the effects of the industrial revolution of the 18th century or the automobile revolution that took place in the 1890s, or before that, the internal combustion engine, which made it possible for farming to be done much more efficiently, so that whereas prior to which about 80-90% of the people used to live in the villages to do farming, etc. Now in modern societies, you just need 4-5% people living in the countryside, because with the assistance of the machines, they can do all that required human brawn power. And these people, then the excess population migrated to the cities, and they started doing various kinds of accounting work and of course other jobs to make life for people living in the cities comfortable. You know, the cleaning of the streets, the restaurants, food, entertainment, and all that stuff. So there was a migration of people from the countryside to the city, and this process continued for 100 years with tremendous prosperity. But even if the coronavirus catastrophe had not occurred, things were clear that the jobs in the city are going to go away, because they will be done by machines. Literally everything that's done in offices will be done by computers. It's already being done by computers much more effectively and efficiently, with less errors. And now we are also talking about robots and other machines, self-driving cars, and 30-40% of the jobs in a developed society deal with transportation. So if you had self-driving cars and they became universally acceptable, suddenly 30-40% of the jobs would go away. And then a lot of the migrants who have come to developed societies do work at the very bottom of the totem pole. Now, those jobs will also go away because robots and other machines will replace humans out there. And therefore, the question then arises, where is the world going to go? What's going to happen? First of all, what is consciousness? Because there is this mystery which remains. This is a mystery that science does not deal with. We all know that we are conscious, but nobody talks about it because it's outside of the framework of science, since science only deals with, just as the phrase of apara vidya, it only deals with linguistic constructs or properties of things, and consciousness is not a thing. It's the light, it's prakasha, light on itself. And therefore, the question of what it is will remain central to the intellectual aspect of human life. So all the sciences are converging, whether you look at it from the perspective of computer science, you look at it from the perspective of psychology, neuroscience, physics. The question of who the observer is, how does the observer make sense of what reality is, and therefore this will be the object of much effort, and that is precisely what the Vedas, what the secret of the Vedas is all about. The Vedas are all about consciousness. Atma Vidya is the science of consciousness. So here we have this amazing situation that, having traveled several thousand years down a certain path related to exploring outer reality, we've reached a point where the deepest question is, what is inner reality? Because we make sense of the outer in the inner. And this reminds one of the famous line, which I paraphrase, line of T.S. Eliot in his Fourth Quartet, that the end of all journeying is to arrive back at the starting point and see it with a fresh pair of eyes. And so this will therefore be the main science effort, if you will, of the coming years, and therefore it will be, in my view, guided, if you will, to a great extent by the insights of the Vedic rishis, their texts, and so on. So people will go back and try to see if there is something that they may have missed, because clearly there are not that many people doing all of it back in India, because as we know, India in the last 50 or 60 years has consciously, for a variety of reasons, moved away from its own sciences to doing a mimicking, if you will, of the West. And therefore, part of this transformation, the corresponding social transformation, would be a rediscovery of India by the Indians. And I think, and this is all universal knowledge. I think perhaps to characterize it as Indian knowledge is sort of miss the point. It's all universal knowledge. We are all human beings are the same, and we all want to find out who we are outside of our social selves. We have an autobiographical self, we have a social self, but at the deepest core, what gives us self-awareness and awareness of the things around us, as to where it might go, is where I think temples and other places, should they enlarge their mission, would be able to provide guidance, because Indian temples, after all, were places of learning. As in that famous book by Dharampal, this book appeared, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago. And what he did was he went back to the descriptions of Indian education before British inspectors arrived on the scene in the 1830s and 1840s. And so this is all written by English writers about what they saw in India. And the picture that you get from there was that these temples were, in fact, colleges and schools and universities. And that whole system was dismantled by the British because they insisted on a certain kind of education. First of all, two things happened. The British de-industrialized India, and the industries that were there prior to coming of the British, which were the best in the world, were, for example, shipbuilding, the industry of textiles. So they placed huge tariffs on textiles because their own factories could not compete. But when later on there was industrial revolution, they also took over the Indian banking system. So they ensured that there was no corresponding investment in setting up of factories in India which could compete with British factories, and therefore India became a place of just consumption of sale or selling of British products. And so this was a great thing for the British Empire. So they did it in a fashion to ensure that India remained backward, and for whatever little jobs that were created by the British, very few jobs. In fact, in 1910, they set up an Indian education service, just as you had the Indian civil service. They set up an Indian education service of professors and so on. There were 120 professors, out of whom I think only 7 or 8 were of Indian birth. The rest were all English people. So there was almost very, very few jobs. And therefore, their own system collapsed. And I mention all this just to make the point that possibly the time has come for these temples, and probably it can't happen in India because the temples are run by the government just to obtain revenue, and to spend the money the way they want. But possibly American temples could take a lead and get into these questions, and possibly even come up with a framework where certain certificates or credentials could be awarded to those who are interested in these questions. And these questions to be done in the most advanced way, where all questioning is encouraged, and where the very fact that there are all these claims with a lot of other evidence which seems to confirm it, that indeed there was this tradition where one was able to, through a very harmonious approach to reality, and this is of course what is called dharma. And dharma, as we know, is what upholds society. The word dhara, from which dharma can be viewed to be derived, or dhri. Dhara is terra. Terra of Latin is dhara of Sanskrit. So whatever upholds society, which is harmonious. And I mentioned this because you know what one is sort of very upset with behind the curtains in the beautiful prosperity that we have in the West, are certain things which are certainly ethically not defensible. And I'm talking of meat factories, for example. And I was shocked to discover, and I discovered it sort of indirectly. President Macron said that after a year, the grinding of live chicks would be stopped in chicken factories in France. And what is the grinding of live chicks? Well, as the eggs hatch, there is a quick test done to determine which chick is male and female. So these are factories for eggs. So the male chicks are shifted to another line, moving line, and then they are immediately put into crushers, and they are converted. These are born just a few minutes earlier. They're crushed and made into feed. Now, I don't know whether they're made into feed for their siblings, but certainly for other pets. So I think having pushed automation to such extreme limits has, in my view, created disharmony at so many different levels, which is not obvious until such time that a crisis of the kind that is upon humanity right now occurs. In fact, I was reading this very fascinating column in the New Criterion by Victor Davis Hanson today, and he was speaking of the Peloponnesian War in Greece and how all these, when the war went on for a long time, different societies had no compunctions in killing prisoners and doing all kinds of horrific murders and so on. In other words, the veneer of civilization is quite thin, and the veneer of our own civilization, of our own contemporary times, is quite thin, and that thinness comes through in moments of crises like the one that we are facing. Because forget this immediate situation. Well, what do you really do as more jobs disappear if 20, 30, 40% of the people are thrown out of work? And of course, people are talking about, UBI, Universal Basic Income. Maybe everybody gets $500 or $700, enough for a room, Netflix, and hamburgers. Would that be enough? What do we live for? So I think there would be a huge restructuring of society. People will ask deeper questions. They will probably move away from the cities also because of the greater risk in the big cities of getting ill by epidemics. So they move into the countryside. There'll be more questioning, and possibly we'll see the birth of maybe a different society all across the world. And I think because of the nature of the journey, India has traveled through. India is, after all, a very, very ancient society. Here we are talking about, even in the most conservative estimates of the Vedas, which go to the 2nd millennium BC and probably are much older, because if you look at the internal astronomical evidence, and some of you might know that I've done a lot of research on that and published papers both in the West and the East on this, which take us to events which are in the 3rd millennium BC and the 4th millennium BC, which people remembered. So it's a very, very ancient society, and we see that this ancient society with the amazing insights has had an influence, a huge influence on the world, even on the Judeo-Christian world, as we know. The Mitannis, who worship Vedic gods, who ruled Syria for about 500 years in the 2nd millennium BC. And the very first monotheist king is generally identified as the pharaoh Akhenaten. And Akhenaten's second wife was a Mitanni princess from this Veda worshipping kingdom of Syria. Her name is Tadukhipa. And many years ago, I analyzed the hymns by Akhenaten with the Surya, because Akhenaten brought in the religion of worshipping the disk of the sun, which for him was the one and only God. And you look at the Surya hymns of the Rig Veda, you find a lot of correspondence. So through all the scholars who went from India to China and to Japan, who took Vedic ideas, of course, in a slightly different garb of Buddhism, but really the same ideas, because we do know that the Buddha himself, as in the Mahaparinirvan Sutra or Sutta of the Mahayana tradition, on his deathbed, he agreed that indeed there was something which was permanent, that it isn't, that the doctrine of anatma or anatta was really not the final thing. There is something which persists, which is, after all, the central idea of the Vedas is that there is something which is transcendent, which is eternal, which is immortal, and which is what is Atman, right? And so those ideas went, and the word dhyana became chan and became Zen. And from northwest of India, you go to the Slavic world. They also worshipped Rudra as rod. In fact, there's a lot of attempt at going back to these pre-Christian sense, because as you know, the Slavic world was converted to Christianity only about 1000 AD. And prior to that, their religion had quite a lot of similarity, because there was all this connection. And so India, in many different ways, has impacted the ancient world, sometimes not directly, indirectly, and also certainly the modern world also. You go around anywhere in the world, including Iran and Arabia, people are doing yoga. And yoga, of course, the asanas are just the doorway to the questioning of, you start off with the body to first of all, recognition of the inner world, the inner body, and opening the doors to that body. And then the other side to it, of course, is you have various techniques as are practiced by the sadhaks, by those who are interested in these deeper questions. And many of these involve just ethical discipline, as happens, let's say, in many Vaishnava tradition, or Tantra, which happens also you have Vaishnava Tantra as well, and certainly in the Shakta and the Shaiva tradition, including the tradition that I come from of Kashmir Shaivism. So all of these tradition, and they are quite universal. Sri Vidya, for example, which is the sketch, a tradition related to the very nature of one's psychological being and how to enter it to be one with the self. So all of this, there are so many different parts, and they are not contradictory, they are complementary. But sadly, a lot of the academic discussion of this quite misses this point, and therefore can lead one astray. And they are complementary, and therefore they help one get connected to different aspects of this experience, and can help one, can guide one through various steps in this experience, to find a deeper sense of oneself. And it's that deeper sense, in Kena Upanishad, there is this question, who knows? And the answer is that he who thinks he knows does not know it. And here, what is the meaning of knowing is that somebody who thinks that this world is only material reality does not know it. And he who knows that it cannot be known, knows it. What that really means is that it cannot be known in terms of material connections, because there is something which transcends our materiality. We are materiality, which of course also in the earliest Vedic narratives is this dichotomy between the asuras and the devas. We are both asuras and devas. The asura form of us is our materiality, and there is this materiality to our existence. And the devas is that sense related to knowing, but knowing itself must.
Can you be quiet? Do whatever you want to do.
Sorry, am I going too fast?
No.
No, no. Okay. Knowing itself must be tied to our internal states. So there's got to be a churning. And this is, of course, this amazing image of Samudra Manthan that we have in the Vedas. It's through this churning within that you can obtain a deeper understanding. So that this deeper understanding, of course, there can also be anugraha. There can also be grace of the deity, and that can certainly happen. But through churning, through effort, through udyam, you can achieve into insights into yourself and help you navigate within to reach points within your own self which make you into a different person. And that is the freedom. The freedom, it's a kind of a contradictory or paradoxical thing. The freedom that the Veda promises you is a freedom to be yourself. And that freedom shows you that what you thought you were looking for is not what you were. Because that sort of falls away. That you have to let go. You reach a point where you arrive at another step where it all now means quite different from what you thought it was. So this is what ultimately, through its very many disciplines associated both with argumentation, which is knowledge, through internal discourse. There are different kinds of yogas, as Krishna, for example, teaches Arjuna, through bhakti, where you are trying to be a part of the divinity within you. So and through ethical preparation, so you have yamas and the niyams and so on and so forth, prepare you to be at a stage where then you can enter into or be ready to see the vistas that become available to you through the window of the doorway of perceptions that open up. And so that's what the secret is. The secret, therefore, is both understanding its very many different elements, and to be at a certain point where one also sees the complementariness of all of these perspectives, so that you can relate to what others are doing, which also is something which is to be lauded, because here is this amazing system which showed you that there were so many different ways to obtaining it, because you're climbing a mountain and you can take so many different paths to reach that top. So it's very different from narrow sectarian perspectives on reality, which lead to violence. And there could be some of that violence which would be accentuated, because as societies which were based on tourism, on spending of money by people from outside, now if once that dries up, because people are very afraid of doing travel right now, and as jobs go away, as economies shrink, it's quite possible that some societies around the world will be taken over by extremists who are looking for very simplistic answers, that this world is nothing but things or such and such instructions, and then you must just live according to those instructions, follow it in a regimented way, and get rid of those who don't follow it in that regimented way. Because what we are talking about here in the Vedas is something extremely deeper. These are the deepest insights, totally consistent with modern science, but going very far beyond it, because modern science doesn't have the tools and instruments to deal with consciousness, because modern science can only deal with objective phenomena or abstract constructs, but it cannot, because these abstract constructs are associated with objective phenomena. So language, which is apara, linguistic knowledge, apara, can only take you that far. So what the secret of the Veda is about the para, about the deepest intuitions about reality. So perhaps I will stop here. Right.
As you were describing in your last, last couple of minutes, the complementariness of different paths or different branch of knowledge, how one can see, and you also gave the analogy of kind of going towards the mountain and you have different paths. So what I feel, and I wanted to get your thought on it, and that is, even if you choose, let's say, one path, whether it's faith-based, you have different faiths, or you have science-based, different branches of science, including psychology and other things that you mentioned, neuroscience and other mathematics and other logical sciences.
Right.
So even if one marches on one path,
right,
will the other path come natural to that traveler? And using your analogy of going up the mountain, if you think of the radial lines that one is marching on, those radial lines are going to converge to the mountain there, right? The goal, objective. So they're getting closer to one another. And before they reach that goal, there will be some overlap in these radial lines because they are coming closer, right? So one will start visualizing perhaps the other science methods and paths and seeing the commonality as one makes progress further and further. And that could also perhaps define the transition of one being on the apara side to para side, if you can think conceptually. So that's how I understand, some of the things that you have described. I hope I have communicated what I'm trying to ask or get your thoughts on.
Absolutely. I think that
this is Prabhat Tekriwal.
Yeah, Prabhatji, absolutely. I agree with you. This is what happens. Once you deepen your practice, whatever your sadhana is, once you deepen your practice, very amazingly, you also get the capacity to understand the intuitions or experiences of those who are engaged in different practice. So in a certain sense, your mind expands and you are able to relate to it, because the deepest experience is not linguistic, or it's not even pictorial. It is something ineffable. You cannot describe it, but you sort of see it. You can see it in somebody's eyes, for example. Hey, this person has had this experience because somehow you got that acknowledgement in the eyes that indeed what you were trying to communicate, that person also has had it. So yes, I think that does happen. And the wonderful thing is that there is recognition that indeed this is the way it is. It's not that one is sort of making it up because it's a nice analogy. It's a nice analogy of going up the mountain, because the mountain that we are talking about is not a physical mountain. And that is the reason why this helps one, you go and speak of even scientific truths to people who have done sadhana, and they can relate to it. They can relate to it. On the other hand, I know some very, very prominent scientists, people who have won Nobel Prizes and so on, and you find that really they lack that deeper understanding of reality, because they themselves acknowledge that, hey, I was in this amazing frame of mind, I was much younger, and suddenly this idea came to me, and that idea was very successful, right? But really they don't understand what the larger picture is. And this is also a problem. I think I should take this opportunity to explain that this is a problem with a lot of academic writing on Hinduism. A lot of academic writing on Hinduism is just plain wrong. And why is it plain wrong? These are people who are academic scholars who, one can imagine there is a beautiful painting and there was a little creature going through every line and describing that this line goes up at this angle, at that angle, and get lost in the details of those lines, would never know what the larger image means. So this is what the problem with a lot of academic writing on Hinduism is. Not all, much of it is. In fact, I was having through Zoom a very interesting lecture by a very prominent scholar. Some of you may know of him, Arindam Chakrabarti. He's a professor at Stony Brook on Kashmir Shaivism. And he was saying that, look, Western scholars are totally wrong, that they look at Tantra as a rebellion against the Vedas, which is not true at all, because it's totally complementary and it's consistent. Because here you have Abhinav Gupta, the great Tantra scholar, who's also taking inspiration from the Vedas and putting it all together. So it's that they are complementary or opposition, because somehow people are getting lost in anthropological context or looking at, struggle between this group or that group, which is really not an issue at all, because Vedic knowledge is ultimately not about the outer, right? It's not laukic. It's paramarthik, right? It's not laukic. It's so it is about the self. It's about Atman, which is the same for every human being. So it's not about jati or community. It's the deepest knowledge that there is. Thank you, Prabhatji.
May I ask a question about Bhakti Yoga?
Sure.
Is it your view that the approach of a bhakta is exactly what opens those inner doors to a wider, deeper understanding? And that even if the bhakta is not searching for knowledge and is given to devotion only, despite that, deeper knowledge will come?
I totally agree with that. I think bhakti opens that doorway because ultimately this ineffable is transcendent. It opens the doorways and it gives the capacity to the individual to relate to the deeper experiences that others may have had. So even though the approach the bhakta might take is could to an outsider appear sort of narrow, that it's only related to devotion to one's deity. But ultimately, after you've gone through that window or doorway, so to speak, you have this broad expanse in front of you. And therefore, then it's the same thing. I do believe in that. So I don't look at it in a kind of a hierarchical sense that one path is superior to another. No, they're all complementary paths, and they all depend upon what path we take depends on the personal situation we might be in. Because ultimately, the reason why people explore is because of a crisis. If you're comfortable, if you're just eating and sleeping, there's no crisis. But life is all about crises. So there's a certain crisis, and that crisis could be triggered by one thing or the other, and there is suffering also involved. And at that point, once one is ready, because you've got to make an investment, you have got to make an investment of emotional and psychological energy in this search. So you really have to have that pain in order to look, and perhaps for many, bhakti often offers that pathway where you're letting your deity take care of you. You're letting go. And letting go is the most important thing. It's like you cannot swim unless you let go. If you're using logic, you will never be able to swim because you'll be afraid of sinking in the water, right? So yes, so to come back to your question, yes, it's as good as any other.
Namaskar, Subhash. First, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to share your enlightening perspectives today. My name is Shiva, and the question I have is sort of being a midlifer and having experienced post-Lord Macaulay education in India, which was so far removed from our wisdom traditions and ancient systems of knowledge. I'm sort of always challenged with the vastness of the Vedas. For example, there's the Vedas and the Up-Vedas, the Vedangas, and you mentioned like Shatdarshan. Can you recommend sort of a more structured path of exploration that would maybe be a little more meaningful, and maybe also some some author recommendations, because I've read several books and some of them, like you said, are totally missing the point.
Yeah, the literature is vast, and there's a lot of wisdom to be found in so many different books. You know, the more you explore them, a cursory reading might show things to be maybe going over familiar ground, but then the deeper you probe it, and this is what some people do when they actually do a text with a teacher. If you do a specific test with a teacher, you find that every word, a truly experienced teacher can show you that every word that's been used in that text opens up so many different doorways, so to speak. But if you don't have a teacher, you're not doing a specific text, and many of these specific texts also require a certain knowledge of Sanskrit. But if you're not doing that, you can use one of so many different ways. You can start off with the Upanishads, for example. They're a wonderful doorway into the vastness. So you start with the Upanishads. And after some time, you might find, well, they are probably being repetitive, because ultimately, many of these are talking of the same thing, of this transcendent reality, and of this bandhu, or the binding between the outer and the inner. And then, of course, there are these techniques related to sadhana. How do we do this search within, through yoga or through other disciplines? Now, I can also recommend, some of my own writings, and you can see some of these writings on medium.com, or my many books. An introductory book is The Wishing Tree, or I also have a book called The Astronomical Code of the Rig Veda, where you'll see that just the very structure, the total number of syllables, the various rituals that were performed had an astronomical basis. Astronomical basis related to the movements of the sun and the moon, which were seen mirrored also within the processes which go on in our own minds. And if you can synchronize those processes, that is one way of meditation. That's how, or you do the vrittis. The vrittis could also be the words and various activities that get reflected in the mind. If you can quieten them, they find that balance, that reflection in your mind's surface of the light of the inner sun. So you can see these books, or I have a book called The Wishing Tree. And then through these books, you'll come across other references. And a good book is in fact called The Secret of the Veda, written about 100 years ago by Aurobindo. That might be interesting to some. A whole great vastness of literature that there is.
Thank you, Subhash.
Sure,
Subhash Kak, I have a question. So this is Narendra Mohan. First of all, I like to express my deep gratitude for taking the time to talk to us, to Hindu community here. And so what you have to say is so profound. So it's like, like ocean of knowledge. How can you all take it in 1 hour? It's just not possible. And so what I would like to propose is that we organize a semester-long course taught by Professor Subhash Kak. Okay, and this COVID-19 is a great opportunity for us to connect through internet, right? And those who may be interested, because everything you have said could be discussed for a day, and so I'm very grateful that Arunji is recording all this, and we can listen to it over and over again. So I just hope that you will consider that proposition, and that is even somewhere close to what you may be willing to entertain. I'd like to get in touch with you, Subhashji. So thank you again. I really, really deeply appreciate what I heard, and you're taking the time to talk to us.
No, sure, Narendra. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I really enjoyed talking, and we have some more time. Yeah, I would be happy to do it, but I'll have to sort of fit it into the schedule over the next few months. Yeah, I think that's a great opportunity, and this is something which truly, as we all know, is the most central thing to all our lives, to every human being's lives, to know who one is and to know what one can be, and to be unafraid and to find joy. Those are fundamental urges that every human being has, and how to reach to it and be, unfortunately, there are those in this tradition, as in other traditions, because all human beings, I have looked at these questions, but here in the Vedic tradition, with the wisdom of the predecessors, with all these rishis, we have this great advantage to sort of reflect, to be shown our own face. In fact, one of the Kashmir Shaiva traditions is called Pratyabhigya, which means the doctrine of recognition. And the whole idea is that if you only knew ourselves, we would know that we possess all this wisdom already. So how do we turn ourselves in a fashion so that we face ourselves? And because it's all within us, we all admit that is the first thing. And you can see that even as a child, you know, we have a 1-year-old grandchild, and we see what she does and this and that, and how she's able to make sense of this world is already in some sense a part of her being. So a part of every human being's being is to know who they are. If we only knew how to turn our gaze onto ourselves, then we would be set free. So this is, in fact, this is the claim. This is the claim in the tradition. And I think that's a wonderful claim. This is a claim which empowers each one of us. It doesn't say that somebody is more privileged than the other in obtaining this knowledge. Every human being is on the same spot.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, Shashikant-ji, yes.
The question I had was, you mentioned about a group of 6 scientists discussing whether the computer can do just about everything that you were discussing, and 3 of them were on one side, the other 3 were on the other side. Which side did you fall, and why?
This was at the highest levels in US government. They put together a group of 20 odd computer scientists, physicists, neuroscientists, and there were some US government program managers as well. And they met 8 different places, including Cambridge. And I was one of the participants, and these were some of the world's leading scientists. And it was in Cambridge that we took a poll. So they were not 6, they were 20 odd, maybe 25
okay, all right.
at that place. And about half said yes. I was not one of those half who said that computers would be.
I thought so.
And so I asked them, I said, why do you believe that computers will become conscious? They said, and there were these were all Europeans and Americans, excepting me. Well, I'm an American, but of Indian background. So they said that, look, what we find most compelling is the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness, of shunyata. And if out of shunyata in biological systems, mind and consciousness has emerged, likewise through machines, by mimicking and embodying brain processes, it should be possible to embody consciousness itself. Now, I was one of those, the other half, who thought this wasn't possible for 2 reasons. One, and I've written a very popular national story, also in the conversation. It's probably one of the biggest stories ever. In the last 4 or 5 months. You can, I think it's called Why Computers Will Never Become Conscious or something. And the argument there is that not everything that goes on in the brain is accessible. Because it's like, like Marshall McLuhan said, reality is in parallel. So many different, while a computer is in serial. So you cannot, first of all, even on a logical ground, access all that's going on in the brain. Or you could also say, again, on logical grounds, that underlying phenomena in the brain are also deeper quantum mechanical phenomena. And as we know, in quantum mechanics, things are not classical. Things happen, they are even connected at far distances from each other. And therefore, on that ground itself, one could say that. Samir Zeki, this well-known professor at University of London, has done research. He's a neuroscientist on brain traces of consciousness, and there is no specific trace. So we're not going. We are only saying why machines, based on our current scientific understanding, cannot mimic those processes. Although consciousness correlates in the brain, but that doesn't mean that consciousness is a consequence of those processes in the brain. There is a logical separation between the two. So my position is more of a Vedantic position. The Vedantic position is that yes, consciousness is something which transcends materiality, and its shadows are to be found in the material processes, but those shadows are not the real thing.
This is Vipin Kumar. I have a follow-up question on that one. Very fascinating discussion again. So as you said, it will be impossible for computers to mimic consciousness, but how about consciousness in, let's say, animals, dogs, cats, insects? How far down can we go and say that, yes, that we can emulate that, but not this?
My answer to that would be no, you cannot mimic any consciousness at all. And of course, the kind of consciousness that exists varies from animal to animal, as we know, but we also know how similar we are to other animals. Any of us who has a pet knows how similar pets are to us. And one could imagine other animals are also similar in that chain. Possibly the analogy that you can use is that the brain of other animals has limitations to the kind of processing it can do. But awareness as a principle is the same. But it's like the capacity that one's brain has. And there are also consciousness states, as we all know. We can sometimes wake up groggy and not know what's going on, or sometimes even forget our own name. So it's quite possible that the consciousnesses of certain other animals are clouded in a fashion so that they don't have the same clarity that we have. But that's true even of human beings, based on social conditioning or based on other factors. Human beings can be in a daze so that they don't see things with the same clarity. And that's why human beings themselves can do horrible things to each other, because they don't have the same clarity. To see that clarity is to see that connectedness in all of us.
Would you say the knowledge gained, even if one becomes at least peripherally privy to the para side through that window of bhakti and whatnot, that the knowledge gained will be very individualistic? I understand what you're saying, like, no, you become kind of knowledgeable of the commonness, like, or existence of the other pieces, or the knowledge developed by others, other branches. But then since it becomes so individualistic in nature, therefore the knowledge gained also is different, and putting it in a common form as a group knowledge would be difficult. And that kind of speaks to the vastness of the knowledge that exists in nature.
I think I get it. My answer to that would be that the way each individual responds to that vision can vary based on the temperament that we are born with. Each of us is born with a certain temperament. A person who's born with a strong ego could use that to control others, could actually become very asuric having stopped at a certain point, because this knowledge is like a stairway. You can also stop. There are also traps. You can believe, hey, this is it. And now let me control others, because there is some wonder, if you will, some satisfaction in prabhutva, in control, in domination. So domination is a kind of in our perspective would be that, hey, this person is stopped, his ego, his ahankar, he started believing that he did it. Because if you really, it's like all creativity or discovery also. Any creative person, honest creative person would acknowledge that indeed, they were in a frame of mind. They don't know where it came from. But an egotistical person would say, no, I did it. This is me. Do you see that? So this can happen. It can have its impact in so many different ways. And as a further add on, so I think what will happen in this post-coronavirus world, as society gets transformed, I think there'll be a lot of new jobs arising related to life coaching, for example. Like the guru of the previous era, that different people would want to talk to others and find out, hey, what do we do? Because there's a lot of excitement and adventure there is in that as well. I still remember my parents, for example, when growing up in Kashmir, they always talked to some people. And these people had a one-on-one relationship. And they would come back home and talk about, hey, this is this and this is that. I think there'll be more of that, less possibly of, okay, you watch this movie or the other. They are fun too. But after some time, these stories that we see on the screen start to pale, lose their power.
Not a question, but just a comment.
Sure.
You mentioned Babbage, and at our university we have Babbage Institute for history of science and technology. So I will certainly mention what you mentioned, the connection between our Vedas and ancient traditions to this computing. And I'll mention it to my colleague and see what happens. I
have a scientific paper where I have all the references on it. Going back to Mary Boole, George Boole's wife, wrote that essay. And this article appeared in the current Science Journal with all the references and so on. And it is accepted by all scholars of Navya Nyaya that mathematical logic, as emerged in the UK in the 19th century, is equivalent to Navya Nyaya. Navya Nyaya is conditional logic, right? Which is what you need in mathematical logic. Mm-hmm. So that's a wonderful thing. And I forgot to complete the background to why Vivekananda spoke about mass and energy transformation. In the Vaisheshika system, first of all, in Vaisheshika, 4 kinds of atoms are postulated. And 2 of them, it's very amazing coincidence. 2 of them have mass and 2 of them do not have mass. The mass ones are Prithvi and Apaha. So Prithvi is solidity, it's like protons, right? Apaha is movement, fluidity, and you have movement by electrons. Then you have Tejas, which is light. And then you have Vayu. Vayu is what decays. In fact, that's what it's stated in the commentaries, that Vayu takes mass away, which is like the neutrino, right? So these are the 4. In traditional physics model, there are 4 stable particles: proton, electron, photon, and neutrino. And now you might say, well, aren't they talking about water and earth and air? No. Because in the argument, it's stated that, look at gold. If you take a gold is solid. Now, if you heat it, it becomes liquid, which means that gold itself also had liquidity within it. If you heat it further, it shines. It becomes bright, which means it starts burning, which means that light or fire was a part of it. And then if you take gold for a long time, it will also lose its mass slowly, which means that Vayu is also a part of it. The property of loss is a constituent of reality as it is, which is amazing, which has a perfect parallel. In fact, I do mention all of this in my book, Matter and Mind. My books are only 99 cents on Kindle. So they're not very expensive. But there's also a printed copy.
So Subhashji, those books could be the basis of your course.
Of course, yeah. More than, certainly, absolutely, yes.
I have a simple question for you.
Yeah.
I read somewhere that the very word Abraham really came from a Brahmana. That is, the person who's looking for knowledge, right? But if you look at all the Abrahamic faiths, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, they all maintain there's a fundamental belief that there's a separation between the self, the universe, and the ultimate reality, which is what we abstract out as Brahman, right? Yeah. So is there a connection between the search for the Brahman, which is the ultimate goal of Hinduism and the Vedas, and the Abrahamic faiths, which kind of have this rigorous separation between these elements? How do you kind of reconcile this? Is that a contribution from the Indian civilization to the West?
Okay, the two, I did mention Akhenaten and his second wife, Tadukhepa, who was a Mitanni princess, right? So I did mention that. The fact of separation depends upon the perspective you choose. There could be an orthodox perspective which says you're all totally separate. But there could also be a perspective where, and there are certain traditions in the Western religion also who say, well, actually, Christ is within you. Do you see that? So they're all different ways, or there could be mystical traditions. There's a mystical tradition in Judaism also, which is called Kabbalah, right? Where you see various levels within you. Now, to add to all of this, there is this famous claim made by Aristotle, and it was inscribed in a tomb at Ai-Khanum, which was a town in Afghanistan, and it's well known to every scholar, where Aristotle said that the original homeland of the Jews was India. Can you believe it? He says Jews came to Judea from India. If you just Google it, you'll find stuff on it. So that when you go back to the past, there are all these murky connections. Mm-hmm. And within India itself, there could be somebody at a certain point in their life or in their development where they would say, no, they are apart from ultimate reality. That they prefer to see themselves as apart from divinity. And that could be one step in a whole sequence of steps where ultimately you can proclaim Aham Brahmasmi, for example, or I am Atma Brahma, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, it all depends upon what is to be done. We are all in the global village. What is to be done, in my view, is to build bridges, is to show the possibilities to everybody. That look, here is what we are saying. We are not out here trying to show somebody is down or not this or that. We are we are this highway which shows you what the facts are, and you can judge them for yourself. We're not going to talk about anything else. And so those historical questions are complicated and different because, as we also know, Al-Andalusi, this was a guy from Spain who wrote a book, I believe in 1130 AD, and he was a scholar. He was an Arabic scholar from Spain when Spain was Islamic. And in this book is called, it's an English translation, and I've mentioned it one place or the other. And this book is called The Sciences in the World. And in that he says, the world's first nation as far as science is concerned is India. Then he also has a chapter on Rome, then he has a chapter on the Persians. Then he also says very interestingly that the Germans and the Chinese have no science. but maybe he was not well informed because he was very far away. But what's interesting there is that he says that the general Arab population before the coming of Muhammad had a religion, for he used the word Sabian, which he also uses for the general religion in India. So it's quite possible that people saw that these connections, that this religion, the Indian religion, was very widespread, not only in the Indo-European world, of which there are many traces left, for example, in the Slavic world, or you go to Lithuania or Estonia, and certainly the Germanic world and the Latin world, right? There's so many parallels, same tripartite division, and the words, of course, the linguistic connections. But also, and I've written on it, you go to Medium, you'll see many of my own articles on it where you'll see all the references, but also with the non-Indo-European world, with Arabia itself, with the Yazidi religion, for example. Yazidis who have gone through such a lot of suffering in the last 10, 15 years. When you look at their own belief system, it's very similar to Hinduism. In fact, they worship the peacock, the peacock angel, which is like Kartikeya, like Murugan. And they also believe in afterlife and so on. So there was all of that there. And I think the time has come. In fact, I must tell you, I was talking to a high advisor, a lady advisor to one of the sheikhs of UAE. I forget which one of those states. And she was telling me, you know what? We want this wisdom, this knowledge also to come to the Middle East. The only problem is that the Orthodox people are going to get very upset. So we want it to come in a kind of a gentle way. And one of the most articulate teachers of yoga is this Saudi Arabian woman who was able to persuade the Saudi king to allow yoga into Saudi Arabia through the window of the Ministry of Sports or whatever. But she knows full well what it means. She goes to Rishikesh, she goes to all of these places. So I think the time has come because it's not sectarian. You know, we are saying that, look, this is what it is. You can have it, or you don't want to have it, you can walk away from it, you know. But anybody wants beauty, right? If you are able to describe it in its right sense, not as something sectarian, I'm sure people will partake of it.
Subhash, this is Sudesh. Can you hear me?
Sure.
I just wanted to thank you so much for your wonderful talk and very informative talk. I just wanted to second the proposal that Professor Mohan had made to see if you could set up some ongoing classes for us. Barring that, maybe you can come back once a month, once every 2 months, or every 3 months to just share your knowledge again with us. So I just wanted to thank you and request that again.
Thank you, Sudesh. We'll have to find out and work on how to do it, because probably travel is going to be complicated. I think for some time people are going to be very frightened by travel. I'm not. You know, my personal take on coronavirus is somewhat like the doctors in Stanford University who are speaking of antibodies, that more people have been already exposed to it, and ultimately more and more people will be exposed to it. The more they are exposed to it, will develop resistance and so on. And for most, it's not as frightening as it's imagined. But still, of course, everybody should take precautions, and people would be careful about travel. But I don't think we should let fear take control of our lives, certainly. So we'll see whatever we can do through the internet or some other ways. We'll see how it can be set up.
Thank you, Dr. Kak. Before I give my closing remarks here, just one quick question, but are there any books, maybe more of an intro level books to the topic that you might recommend to everybody today that you've written?
Well, yes. Firstly, the Medium essays. If you go to medium.com and type my name in, you'll see many, many different essays. And one of them is called The Secret of the Veda, and there are many others. And perhaps the book, The Wishing Tree, the 2015 edition, would be useful. Because there I also talk about science. I didn't tell you anything about the most amazing correspondences in terms of numbers, the meaning of the number 108. I didn't tell you that at all, how I made that discovery, and why do we have 108 beads in the Japamala, and how the sun and the moon are 108 times their respective diameters away from Earth, and how we see the deity within, the lamp of consciousness within, also 108 units, which is why we make this symbolic journey. All kinds of amazing things, and some of them you will find in The Wishing Tree.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So with that, thank you, Dr. Subhash Kak. Thank you very much for being with us here today. I don't know if we can do this over Zoom, but if everyone can show their hand, just a big round of applause. Thank you so much. I know you were at our temple last year in person, so hopefully when all of this clears up and we're all free to travel and move about, we look forward to having you. Please do come to our temple in Maple Grove, Minnesota next year. It would be great to have you again. I also wanted to thank Arun Bhargava and Ned Mohanji, please, for setting up this presentation today. HSMN does a lot of other adult discourses as well, so please reach out to Arunji if you have any more information, everyone. Again, a big thank you. I want to be very appreciative about the fact that everyone who is on the Zoom call has a very key level of interest in this topic. So this group here is a very special core group of people from HSMN who enjoy going down just that extra level, a little deeper. So everyone, thank you for joining. So with that, we will wrap up today. Thank you,
Pooja. Thank you, everybody, for your time and having this conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott.